Back in 2010, Disney released the most expensive animated movie ever. This was probably a pretty risky move because the Walt Disney Animation Studio wasn't doing too hot at that point. At the turn of the century, Walt Disney feature animation had been pretty hit or miss, and the studio was kinda going through a minor identity crisis. Classic 2D animation wasn't getting the audience that it once did, which is kind of a bummer when that's what the studio was primarily known for and what they'd been doing for the past 60, almost 70 years. No, audiences were way more excited about the computer animated films from a little company called Pixar. Walt Disney Animation Studios tried to do some computer animated films, but they were,
Who put that bar there?
they looked pretty shit. So naturally, in 2006, Disney ended up buying the entirety of Pixar. So now Disney was back in the animation game. They had a very popular, very successful animation studio. It just wasn't the one with the founder's name on it. After the acquisition of Pixar, the Disney leadership was beginning to discuss whether or not it made sense to keep the Walt Disney Animation Studio. It seemed kind of redundant to have two major animation studios, especially when one of them had great momentum and was churning out hit after hit, and the other one didn't. So Walt Disney Animation Studios was in a rough spot. They needed to evolve with their audiences if they didn't want to be left in the dust. But they also needed to find their own voice and the thing that made them uniquely Disney animation. And this is where that risky move that I was talking about comes into the picture. After a really shaky decade, the Walt Disney Animation Studio made not just their most expensive film, but the most expensive animated film ever. It was a film that would usher in what I would venture as far as to call the second Disney Renaissance. It was a marriage of the new computer animation technology and the signature Disney magic. It was a computer animated film, but the studio had gone back to its roots, and this was to be the first computer animated princess film. And you already know this, I am of course talking about Tangled. A movie about a young princess who's stolen away by an evil witch and locked in a tower deep in the forest, where one day her strapping savior will climb her hair and save her. Well, of course, Rapunzel turns out to actually, for the most part, be pretty capable of saving herself. What you might know is that Tangled, like so many Disney films before it, is based on a classic fairy tale. This one by the Brothers Grimm and simply titled Rapunzel. Now, there are a bunch of different reasons why Disney renamed the film from Rapunzel to Tangled. Partly because there technically are two main characters of the film, and partly because they thought that boys didn't want to go see a movie with a girl's name in the title, which obviously is stupid, but also probably kind of true. But that's not really what I wanted to talk about today. No, what I wanted to talk about today is the dilemma that most writers encounter when they're writing an adaptation of an existing story. What do you keep and what do you discard? And let me just tell you, there are a couple of big ones that Disney definitely didn't want in their family film. So let's get into it. These are the things that Disney didn't tell you about Rapunzel. And let's start off with the princess herself, Rapunzel. Because in the original fairy tale, she isn't even a princess. I know, right? No, whereas movie Rapunzel's parents are the king and queen of Corona, a name that has aged more terribly than anyone could have predicted, fairy tale Rapunzel's parents are just two completely ordinary people who just so happens to live next door to an evil witch. And I say evil because she does take their daughter, but she actually isn't completely in the wrong. Because when the story begins, Rapunzel's mother's pregnant, just like in the movie, but she doesn't get sick. Instead, she gets the weirdest pregnancy cravings for some of the flowers that they see in the witch's garden. And it's not like magical flowers like the one we see in the movie, it's just completely ordinary bellflowers. But the mother tells her husband that she thinks she's going to die if she doesn't get some of those flowers. So the husband does the only thing he can think of and scales the wall to the witch's garden with the intent of stealing some of the flowers. But naturally, when he enters the garden, he's met by the witch, who's not too happy about him stealing her flowers. But the husband explains the situation to the witch and they end up making a deal. He is allowed to take as many bellflowers as he wants, but in exchange, the witch wants their child. So when Rapunzel is finally born, the witch shows up and steals the little girl away from her parents. And the parents are never heard from again. No, seriously, they don't even go looking for her. And they definitely don't send up any lanterns or nothing. Nuh-uh. They made a deal with the witch, and however unfair that deal might have been, they're gonna honor it. So yeah. Years go by and Rapunzel is placed in a tower deep in the forest. And this is basically just like the film. The only way to get into the tower is by climbing up using Rapunzel's long, beautiful hair. And this is about where we get to another point that Disney definitely felt like they needed to change for the film. Because in the movie it's straight up said that Rapunzel is 18 years old. However, in the original fairy tale it's a little bit different. While it's not explicitly said how old Rapunzel is at the end of the fairy tale, we are told that she's 12 years old when she's locked in a tower. And from there it's said that a couple of years goes by before she meets the prince. Yeah, in the original version she is a nobody and the guy who saves her is a prince. Whereas in the Disney version it's obviously the other way around. Flynn Rider is a nobody and she is a princess. But anyways, if it's only been a couple of years between her being locked in the tower at 12 years old and her meeting the prince, that means that she's around like 14, maybe 15 years old. And of course that in itself isn't particularly problematic, but it is though, and we'll get to why in a bit. First I want to mention a fun little thing that is actually translated really well in the film. Because Tangled is obviously a musical, there are loads of amazing songs throughout the film. And when the prince in the fairy tale first finds Rapunzel in the forest, what is she doing? She's singing. I know it's just a small detail, but I just really like that the film's a musical because that's how and why the prince actually meets Rapunzel in the fairy tale. It's just a small element of the story that actually had a pretty big impact on the film. Alright, so the prince falls in love with Rapunzel's voice and he really wants to see her. And one day when he's sitting listening to Rapunzel singing, the witch comes by and says, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And he then sees how she climbs up the tower using Rapunzel's hair. So the prince comes up with the ingenious plan of doing the exact same thing. Just walking straight up to the tower and yelling, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And for some reason, it works. I mean, I guess Rapunzel has just been locked up for so long that she can't distinguish between the voice of an old woman and that of a strapping young prince, but I don't know. Anyways, it works and he gets up there and finally meets Rapunzel. And they more or less instantly fall in love. That's fairy tales for you. So they hatch a plan where every night when the prince comes to visit her, he brings a small piece of silk thread, which Rapunzel will then use to braid a ladder. Some people might have suggested that he just bring a frickin' rope and they get the heck out of there, but what do I know? But their plan works pretty well for a while. The prince brings one tiny thread every day and Rapunzel gets to work on her escape ladder. That is until the day when Rapunzel accidentally asks the witch why she's so much heavier than the prince when she climbs her hair. And that is obviously just the biggest rookie mistake from Rapunzel right there. I mean, one thing is to frickin' reveal the whole escape plan, but she had to go and make it about the witch's weight as well? That's just stupid. Well, naturally, the witch gets mad as hell. She cuts off Rapunzel's hair and places the girl somewhere in a great big desert. Then, the next time the prince comes by to see Rapunzel, the witch is waiting for him. She threatens him, but he jumps out of the window, but he lands in a bush full of thorns that poke his eyes out. And yeah, that's probably a bit too graphic for a Disney film. The prince then blindly stumbles around for years until he finally one day happens to stumble into the desert where the witch had placed Rapunzel. And this is where we get back to that whole thing about Rapunzel's age. Because when the prince finally meets Rapunzel again, she's given birth to a pair of twins. And he's the father. So at some point when the prince and Rapunzel were executing their grand plan, they must have been doing the old horizontal mambo. Yeah. I mean, it's not really a wonder that Disney left that little detail out of the film. 15-year-olds doing the dirty isn't really what you associate with the Disney brand. But there is actually a different part of the ending that curiously is very much a part of the film. Because, as I mentioned, there's no magical flower in the original fairy tale. But Rapunzel does seem to have some sort of magical healing power. When she and the prince finally meet again, she starts crying and her tears fall on the prince's eyes, which are instantly healed back to normal. So even though there's no magic flower and her hair has long since been cut, she still manages to heal him in the end. Her healing abilities are once again one of those small little details that Disney has really played up for the film to make the story a bit more fantastical. Like I said at the beginning, whenever you do a film adaptation of a book or a fairy tale, you always have to juggle how much you keep and how much you omit. But I honestly really think that Disney did a great job with Rapunzel. There are some pretty big things that they left out, like Rapunzel's pregnancy and the fact that her parents just willingly gave her away to the witch. And on top of that, she isn't actually a princess. But the original story would never have worked as a film if you hadn't changed a few things and added some others. All in all, I actually think Disney stayed very faithful to the fairy tale. But what do you think? Do you like Tangled, and do you think it would have been better or worse if they'd kept more of the original fairy tale? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, have a look at that like button. I feel like it needs a bit of love. Just like the subscribe button that you're more than welcome to press if you want to see more videos from me. But that's pretty much all I had for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care and so long.